Hi, I hope everyone's doing well today. If we're going to spend the first 10 minutes of class like normal, answering questions. They can be questions about pretty much everything. While people start to ask questions, I'm going to spend some time going over. There are no panelists today. There will be panelists tomorrow to answer that question. Yep, I am. Zul or Zul, I'm not sure how to say it, but if you tell me how to say it, I'll say it again. I'll say it correctly in the future. Will I be able to go over the second part of the exercise? Yes, I'm going to go over the full exercise. I'm going to do the exercise in its entirety at the beginning of the class, and then I'm going to. I went through all of the submissions that you put in. Or at least I went in through a lot of the submissions that you put in, and I kind of wrote up some of my most commonly seen mistakes or kind of like nitpick type things. So I will go through those as well so that we can all be on the same page about kind of the style and what's typically done in Ruby. Our race so says, I love the lesson so far. Question, why in Codespace next to the main branch is there a yellow X? Okay, so I'm assuming that you mean in the terminal. So I go to the terminal. Yeah, so the terminal that's being used here has what's called, everyone doesn't have to know this, but I'm just going to go through it because we have a little bit of time here. Has what's called a PS1 setup. So that is what makes it so that it can output all these like nice colors and things. So I think the first thing here is either the word Codespace or the user. I think it's the user in this case. So you can verify that. Actually, I'll just show you. So and see my terminal. If I write who am I down in the terminal here, you're going to see that it says Codespace. So that tells us that the name of the user that I'm logged into in this Codespace is actually called Codespace. The next part here is the working directory that you're currently inside of. And then the next part is a Git extension. So this part tells you what branch you're on. So if I were to do something like git-co-b hello, it's going to complain that I don't have checkout-b hello. Now it's going to change and I'm on the hello branch. So we'll go back to the main branch. And then what this X is, I think, is that you have unstaged changes, although I could be wrong about that. We can actually, if we wanted to, try to dig into how it works. They're using here a shell called ZSH, and they're using a tool called OhmyZSH, which if you're interested, is a great tool. I use it personally for my terminal. Again, anyone that doesn't know what a terminal is or isn't interested in this part, you don't need to know this. So it looks like it's just the default setup for OhmyZSH. You can have the same thing on your computer if you would like. Okay, can you go over the small example? Yes, I'm going to go over the full example from yesterday, just as soon as we get started in the class. I like to take the first couple minutes here to answer some general questions and wait for people to come in. It looks like we have about 124 people on so far. Quick question for the docs reference site, the version that we are running. Yeah, so if you're interested to know what version we're running, go to the terminal, just type ruby-v. So you can see that in the terminal here, we're running 2.7.1. What I will tell you is that for most of the Ruby that we're going to see in the course, it's not going to make a difference. You can run it on Ruby 2.7.1, 2.9, or sorry, 2.7.2 or 3.0. Those are kind of the 2.7.2 and 3.0 are kind of the current accepted versions of Ruby. 3.0 is very new, so a lot of Ruby developers and Ruby apps are not there yet. I am correctly pronouncing it. Yeah, I appreciate it. Again, if I ever say anyone's name incorrectly, feel free to correct me or shoot me a message. I'm not doing it on purpose. I wanted to output all of exercise 2 on one line. I use print instead of puts. Yeah, we can talk about that briefly, kind of while we're sitting here. So in puts, the there's another thing next to puts called print. And if I say welcome, and I'm going to run this code, I'm going to see what happens here. So you see the output. I'm going to close Slack so I don't get the sounds. The output here has a print, and then it has a puts, and it's probably obvious what is different between them. Can anyone tell what the difference is between the print and the puts, just based on what we saw here? Yep, line end is exactly right. So what happens is the puts, when it's finished, there's actually an invisible character at the end here. And that invisible character creates a new line, which is why when I put two puts next to each other and I run that, you're going to see that it goes to a new line. So puts is equivalent to print welcome, and then you can actually put that invisible character in. It's called a new line character. And if you put \n, that's how you can get the new line character with print. So to answer the general question of why you would use puts over print is that it's weird to have to write a string and then put \n at the beginning. So the real question you should be asking is why use print instead of puts? And the answer is only use it in the case that you don't want a new line at the end. It's useful in the case that you wanted to do something like this. For example, did this, and you did put a space there, and then you changed the second one to a puts. So now this is the equivalent of print welcome space, no new line, and then puts John, which will have a new line on the end. So when I run this, you'll see what it does. It says welcome John on one line, followed by a new line. Okay, next question. Are there any sites that can help make an IT resume? I don't know of any offhand. There are definitely resume review circles that you could get into, where you send your resume and get feedback. I submitted my repository with my name. It says private. Yeah, please make the repository private. Keep it private. I can see it. Other people can't see it. When you check the submission in GitHub, I do not check your submissions in GitHub. So I'm here. I'm going to review them every time to get an idea of the common problems that people have run into. And then I will go over those, which I'm about to do right after this. How do you submit your assignment? You don't have to submit your assignment. It's for you. But if you do put it up there, it's going to help me make the course better. Can you explain the difference between key colon value and key arrow value? Yes, I'll be talking about that. It's one of the first things I'm going to talk about today. If you have time, can you share some helpful ZSH plugins? I might have time at the end, but in the meantime, oh my ZSH is the thing that you're looking for. Is there a way to quickly comment a lot of code at once? There isn't generally, but I think the editor probably can help with that. So there either is some extension or some kind of key shortcut that if someone knows it, please put it in the chat, but some way to grab multiple lines and be able to essentially comment them. I just don't know how to do it. Yeah, another way that you can do it is you can use begin and end like this. It's not very common. I would not do this. A lot of times if you have multi-line comments, you'll just put, instead of doing the begin and end, you just put the hashtags at the beginning of each of them. After you commit changes, stage changes and commit. Once I try to push the file, it shows me an error. Yeah, so you have to stage the changes, commit, and push. Yeah, if it shows you an error, please drop that in a discussion somewhere so that someone can see what the error is. Your 2 cents. It appears that we cannot simply use special symbols like colon in string. Yeah, that is a good point. I'll go over this briefly. So you're probably wondering, or maybe you have wondered, if you write welcome and then you want to write welcome John. Let's try to run this and see what happens. Okay, so again, the error. Let's think about, like, if you're a computer and you're reading this line, how you read it. So it's puts welcome the string, and then just like some random characters, John, and then an empty string afterward. To a computer, this doesn't make any sense. It's confusing because the computer doesn't know when you have the second quote that it's inside of a string. It thinks that you're ending the string. So you're going to end up with an error. So to avoid that, you can tell the computer that you want a quote by, again, putting a backslash before the quote. This is not something you're going to have to do often. And there are actually a couple of ways around it. So one way around it is if you know that the string you have has double quotes inside of it, you can just use single quotes. And then you're probably wondering what happens if you have something like that. It's pretty outside of the scope of what we're doing, but there actually is a special way to do it where you can do that. And what it uses this different character, so it won't close until it ends up with another one of these. This is pretty advanced. Typically, you're not going to need it. These are the ones that you should focus on. How much time outside the class do you recommend we spend time learning materials? I'd say enough time to do the exercise as I've said to do it, and then a little bit more to kind of like explore. Why is the cursor in the lower side of the code space so thick? I don't know. Are you talking about the block cursor? This cursor? It's not the it's a different style of cursor. It's called I don't remember the name. We'll just call it a block cursor, but it's not the cursor. It's the it's so that when you go back, you can see where you are. So it sits after that where you type, and then if you want to go back, it shows you where you are. Just a different style of cursor. Yes, puts has a new line. I can talk about what a staff engineer does at GitHub at the end if you ask again. And the exercise of capital the letter, I'm going to talk about that in a second. So I'm just going to get into it. Okay, since we're already in here, let's just go through the exercise real quick. The first thing that I asked you to do in the exercise was to create a variable which holds a string of the name of your best friend. I guess my best friend would be my wife, so put name equals Kate in quotes. I want you to output the length of the name. Let's run that. Then I want you to output the name reversed. Let's run that. Itak. Then I want you to output the name with the first letter capitalized. So I could do it like that, except that's not, I think I explicitly told you to not do that. So what I would expect instead is something like 0 plus name like this. Now, there's a couple of things here. First thing is name of 0 is pretty interesting because it's getting the first letter of the string. This is getting from the second position of the string, meaning remember that strings and pretty much everything in programming is 0 indexed. So this is the first position. Sorry, this is the 0th position. This is the first position, second position, third position. So first we're getting name of 0, which is K. Then we're getting name of 1 ... which is this. Now, I didn't teach you the ... yesterday. So I would also accept something like this, which is going to be exactly the same. I would also accept something like this. It's also going to be exactly the same. I would also accept something like this. You don't have to know this, but this is another way to write the ... form. If you put a -1, what it means is go from 1 to the end of the string. And we will talk probably never about this. So it's either something that you have to know or just get rid of. Yeah, that's a great point. Name.length is also an option. So you can put name.length in here. And that'll work exactly the same. So this is in this case saying from 1 to name.length. Okay, next thing, I'm going to keep it like this because it's the smallest. You could even do, if you wanted, name of 0, name 1 ... That's also perfectly fine. Okay, then there's some exploration comments. Then we're going to go to exercise 2. So exercise 2, we're going to create a hash. In here, we're going to take, yeah, sorry, you're right. It's not. This should be uppercase. Okay, hope that makes sense. Sorry to confuse name of 0 ... uppercase, name of 1 ... Okay, in the second example, we want to create a hash where the key is the name and the value is the age. You could use capitalize, but I think I tried to purposely create the constraint where capitalize was not going to be used. Because if you're going to use capitalize, then you may as well just call name.capitalize. Now I want to create a variable that holds one of the names, and then I want to output a sentence that says the name and the age by using a hash lookup. So it'd be something like name is hash name years old. John is 34 years old. Okay. Yeah, someone mentioned the comment about the multi-line comments using control plus and for JS. That's really, it's more of an editor specific thing than a Ruby specific thing. So you'd have to look up what works for Visual Studio Code. Yes, I will talk about someone just put a solution in the chat. I'm going to talk about that. I'm going to talk about that solution. Okay, so someone says command plus. So let's try it. No, control command plus. Control command slash. Okay, I got it. You can select multiple lines and you can use command slash. You can toggle it back on and off. That's the best way to do the comment. That's what you should do. Don't use equals begin equals end. It's just weird. Okay. So we have a lot more things to talk about with this exercise real quick. So first, and I also want to say before I even get into this that I saw a lot of people experimenting. So a lot of people's code files included other explorations of different string methods, things like that. I really appreciate seeing that. That is a great way to learn, and it's how you're going to progress even quicker than just doing the things that I tell you to do. Is there any way to output the sentence without the hash? Sure. I think you could. I think this should do the same thing. No implicit conversion of nil into string. Hash of name. What have I done? I mean, really, the answer is the thing that I wrote previously. If you change these to plus signs, it's gonna work. But really, the answer is the interpolation. It is weird in Ruby, at least. Right. The reason it's not working is because this thing is not a string, which kind of highlights why you would use the interpolation. The interpolation makes it easy. Other languages that don't have interpolation, you'd have to write it something like this. But Ruby does have that interpolation, meaning the string with the little hash symbol and curly brace, and it's used everywhere. Everyone uses it. It is not. It's not like a weird feature. It's a. If you don't use it, that's weird. Okay, so I saw some things. I saw some people, when they created the hash, they did this. So instead of creating one hash, they created John hash, and they did name, John, age, 34. And then they created separately a Kate hash. Now, while this is something that is valuable to do in some cases, for this exercise, it doesn't make a ton of sense, because when you want to do a hash of name, the point of the exercise was kind of to take hash and be able to access a property of it by name. In the version where we write the code like this, we'd actually be taking John hash and putting it in here and accessing it like that. So I think like it's a fine solution, but it's not quite what I was looking for. Another one is that I saw a lot of people when they were writing code, they would do something like they would do something like puts John dot reverse like this. When you do something like this, I can tell that you have experience in another programming language. And in Ruby, there's kind of an unspoken rule or possibly a spoken rule that if something has arguments, we include these. And if something doesn't have an argument, instead of including the empty ones, we just remove them. So John, the string dot reverse, this is actually a method call to the method reverse. You don't include the parentheses. Actually, just to scare you a little bit, these ones are optional too. So even if something does take an argument, you don't always have to include them. If you have a question in particular, please, if you can just drop it in the Q&A. I know there's a lot of stuff going by in the chat, and I want to make sure I catch your questions. Another thing I want to call out for people that have programmed before is the fact that John of 0 dot upcase. Now, if you've programmed in a different programming language other than JavaScript and Ruby, this is going to be a little weird to you because John of 0 normally would return what we call a character. So it would return not a string, it would return a different data type. In Ruby, any subset of a string is also a string. So they're not any different. You can grab subsets or single characters from a string, and when you do that, you're just getting another string back. There is no character type. Yeah, the parens are not necessary. It's very interesting. And there are no characters. By far the most common thing that I saw in your examples is, and it might be because of a comment someone left in the chat, is that when you're writing your hashes, you would write something like this. Now, this is not the same as the thing that I was trying to get you to write, which was this. And to prove that they're not the same, I'm going to take 1 and take 2, and I'm going to use a special method called inspect. And then I'll put #2.inspect. So what this is going to allow us to do is get a more detailed output of what's actually happening. And you see in the inspect output here, the first example has a colon, name, and then it equals greater than. The second example has a string equals greater than. So does anyone know the difference, or is the difference obvious here? The difference is that the first hash is a hash where the keys are not strings. They're called symbols. And I was purposely trying to avoid getting into this at this point, but cat's out of the bag, I'm going to have to talk about it. The second hash, the keys are strings. So you can see here a symbol and a string. I'm going to talk about what symbols are in just a second, but I want to clarify that these are different. When you see a hash written like this, the actual way I want you to read that hash is like this. Not yet, 34. So this first one is a shorthand for the second one, okay? So it's a different thing. In this one, the keys are strings. In this one, the keys are symbols. So I'm going to go into it now just because I'm sure you're all pretty confused about what a symbol is. Think of a symbol just like a string. It is just a string. A lot of times in our code, we have a need to pass around certain values. So we want to say like, like call some method and be able to pass something to it. And instead of making that a string, we can use a symbol instead. And the reason we'll use a symbol instead is because a symbol can never be modified. It will always be the same thing. So use a string when you want to be able to take something and maybe be able to add something to it or change it in the future. Use a symbol when you're talking about an object, a thing that can never change. So we're not going to see this for a bit in our code, but once we get into Rails, we're going to see a lot more symbols. I hope this difference makes sense. I was trying, like I said, to avoid talking about this difference because I think that just by itself, it makes no sense at all. So just when you think about it as it's just the string, except instead of it being of the type string, it is of the type symbol, and it can't be modified. So just like strings can change, symbols cannot change. And there are a bunch of other details there, but that's the point, is that symbols don't change. Okay, I'm going to read through some questions here because I'm sure that there are a bunch of questions about what I just said. Is there any other? I answered that already. Yep, someone used plus signs. That's the right idea. Okay, so someone here has put some code. I'm going to copy that code into here so we can all see it together. So what they've done is they've created a hash, and then they've done something here that we haven't seen yet, and we're outputting this. We're going to talk about that today. So it's actually good that you're bringing this up, but it is jumping ahead a little bit. So I'm going to hold up on talking about it. The next person wrote this. Okay, so the question here is why are these different? So one is plus equals 97, which is the equivalent of writing this. And one is using this operator, which I taught you yesterday. Now, if we want to know the difference, we can go look at the documentation for string, and we can find the difference. So first, let's look at this, and let's see how it works. It looks, if the object is an integer, the value is considered a code point and converted to a character before concatenation. So the reason that it's working is that the left shift method on string knows how to take in an int and turn it into a character, while the plus equals 1 does not. If you're out there and you're new to coding, do not worry about what I just said, but I think it's important to clarify for people that are interested in how to find an answer like that. Yeah, so someone asks, can we draw a parallel between dictionaries in Python and hashes in Ruby? I assume you were not in the class yesterday, but I drew that parallel. They're the same thing. And same with name John, age 34. If you use the colons after the string, you are going to get symbols as keys. And the next question is, would you be able to mutate a key that is a string? You cannot, because when you actually do the less than operator, you're getting back a new string. This is something that's different in different versions of Ruby, but I think it's a little too advanced to get into right now. We can talk about that at the end of the course if you want to do it, or you can just try it in your Ruby and see what happens. Okay. Another thing I want to introduce before we keep going, I hope I got everyone's questions. I think I did. So another thing I want to introduce is something from yesterday that I didn't cover, and I purposely avoided covering because it is not going to make a ton of sense. If I say I want the thing at ARR of 0, what is this going to output? Yep, it's going to output 1. What are you going to get if we do ARR of 10? So in a lot of programming languages, the answer to this is going to be an error, but actually in Ruby, it's not an error. There's just like some empty space in here. So what's going on? There is maybe an empty string being output. There's like nothing here, and it's very confusing. And this is where something like inspect can really help. So I'm going to put inspect on the end of each of these. We'll run it again. You can see what happens is that 1 gets output here, and the second one, nil, gets output. So people who are new to programming might say nothing, and you're right. that's exactly what this is. Nil is the non-presence of the answer. So when we do puts ARR of 10.inspect, it's saying, what's the position 10? Nothing. Nothing's there. And because the computer has to return something, it returns nil, which is a special value that means nothing. I hope that makes sense. If it doesn't, it's okay. Another place that this comes up is what is hash of John? Or sorry, what is hash of John? We inspect that, run it, it's nil. So trying to access a property that doesn't exist on arrays or hashes is going to return nil. And nil comes up in a whole bunch of other interesting places too. So there's a question in the chat here. Can you repeat what inspect does? So what inspect does is it takes the object and it calls, well, actually, let's just go look at what inspect does. That'd be interesting. So inspect is a method that's implemented on a lot of different classes. So every class in Ruby can implement inspect the way that it wants to. So for example, inspect on a string is just the string itself. If we look at inspect on nil, it's just going to be something like def inspect nil. We're going to talk about functions today. So if you're confused about functions, don't worry about it. But inspect is just a way to get a more detailed version of what thing you're looking at. It's just a special method that most classes in Ruby implement so that you can find out more details about what's inside of them. Yeah, if you're from a background like C or C++, you would expect an out of bounds array access to retrieve a garbage value, but that's not how Ruby works, because Ruby, it's meant to be non-surprising and readable. If you've ever run into, like, there's basically never a case in the average course of writing C or C++ code that you would want that behavior. So Ruby protects the programmer by not allowing that behavior. Okay. So we're going to talk about a lot of stuff, just like yesterday. Today, I'm hoping to cover Ruby loops, hoping to talk about Ruby iterators, and I'm hoping to talk about functions and how functions work and how they get used. And I'm hoping to talk about Ruby blocks. So we're going to go through a lot of stuff. And then, of course, there's going to be an exercise at the end. So what is a loop? Well, at its simplest, a loop is the ability to do the same thing over and over again. So if I do something like loop do, and I put hello world, I play, you can see what happened here is a little concerning. The bottom has frozen. And the code space is essentially trying to figure out what to do. And it's outputting the same thing over and over and over and over and over and over, just forever. So I'm actually going to try to stop it from doing that because it's not good. But you can, hopefully that illustrates what a loop does, is it does the thing inside of it over and over again. So you can see it's reconnecting. I think I broke it. Please don't do that if it's something that okay, don't do what I just did, please, because someone's going to message me and say, why'd you do that? Let's reload this and see if we can get it working again. So this is like that example that I was talking about yesterday, where when I was learning to program, my dad wrote code like that and broke the computer. That's exactly what we just did. We actually crashed the container by writing loop do inside of it, which is pretty wild. So that is called an infinite loop when you do this. So you're providing a loop for the computer and giving it no way out of the loop. It's not very useful, is it? Because like if you create a loop like this, it's just going to go forever. So This is not a great loop, but it does illustrate what a loop does. It just does something over and over again. A more useful loop is called a while loop. And the way that you write a while loop is you write while condition end. And then inside of here, you can write some code. So what does that mean? Imagine we had a number and we call it number equals 0. The condition we might write is something like while number is less than 10. And then we want to output number. And then we want to take number and say number equals number plus 1. So if I run this, let's see what it's going to do. I haven't broken the whole thing. Yeah, so now you can see the output. The output is to print out all of the numbers from 0 through 9. Okay, so if you look, why is it doing that? Let's try to read this with our, again, like the tip I was saying a lot yesterday is try to read this as normal English. Number equals 0. While number is less than 10, output the number and then take the number and add 1 to it. And you can almost like imagine doing that like on a piece of paper, right? Like we have a number, the number is 0. Okay, and then while the number is less than 10, keep doing the thing. So is the number less than 10? Yes. So output the number and add 1 to it. Eventually, you're going to get to the place where the number is 9. And then you're going to say, is that number less than 10? You say, yes. Output the number, output 9. Then you're going to change the number to 10. And when you do that, now the number's not less than 10 anymore. So the loop ends. The loop ends as soon as this condition becomes true. So this is a way to tell the computer that you want it to repeat something until this condition becomes true. So we were looking at the comparison operators yesterday, like equals equals, or not equals, or greater than. That's using the same thing as this, which is set a number to 0, while number is less than 10, do this stuff inside. So any questions on the while loop before I keep going? Yep, until the condition is no longer true. Yeah, so why isn't it number equals 0 plus 1 until infinity? So it's a good question. You have number equal to 0 here, and then inside the while loop, because there's an equal sign here, you're modifying number. So you're saying, okay, number equals 0. Now you're saying number equals whatever number was before plus 1. Does that make sense? Number equals whatever it was before plus 1. A lot of times you'll read this as increment number, which is saying just add 1 to whatever the number is. Okay, does that help? Why is it that I put number equal number plus 1, puts number, I get 1 to 11? You probably have number equal to 1 when you're starting up here. I just checked that your code looks exactly like this. Okay. Does the white space and indentation matter? Well, it's funny you should say that because normally Ruby is indented with 2, not 4. But my editor here is set to 4, and I feel like if I change it, I'm going to confuse a lot of people. So I'm going to keep it like this for now. Maybe I'll have it changed by the next, but white space does not matter. Indentation doesn't matter. What matters is new lines, meaning while here has to be on a separate line than puts. Because if it wasn't, then to the computer, it's going to look like that. And that doesn't make any sense. Okay. If you want a shorter way to write this, because this is something that you'll have to do pretty often in computers, the quicker way to write it is this: number plus equals 1. This is not a thing. Don't do this thing. Don't do it. If you're in another language, you might have seen it. You don't do it here. Your number plus equals 1. That's how we write it in Ruby. That's how it works. So same code, does the same thing, increments the number. Now, because this, yes, the plus plus is confusing for a ton of reasons that I can get into after the class if someone wants to talk about that. So because this is Ruby, and yep, it works in JavaScript too. Because it's Ruby, there's another version of while that is used pretty often, and it's called until. So imagine we wrote this. Now, one of the greatest things about Ruby is that it reads like English, right? The number is 0. Until the number equals 10, output the number and increment it. So this is the same piece of code that you flip the other way. Yeah, if you reload the code space, I think the code space has to be killed and recreated, but it does it transparently. So now we have until. It works just like while, except the other way around. So in other languages, you might have to write this like while not number is 10. In Ruby, you can use this until form, and it's the same thing. Yeah, it'll only go until 9 now. And you can think about why it only goes until 9. It's going to stop doing the loop once the number equals 10. So it's going to run it when it's 8 because 8 doesn't equal 10. It's going to run it when it's 9 because 9 doesn't equal 10. And then when it gets there and it tries to run it the last time when number is 10, it's going to say, oh, wait, number does equal 10. And that's the point where it stops, not afterward. So that's why that happens. First, it checks exactly. First, it checks the condition, then it runs the loop. If you're interested, there is a way to have it not do that, but I'm not going to cover that in the course, and it is not something I think you should probably ever do. So. Okay, so the next question is, what if it's like 9.5, then 10.5, does it continue? In this case, it would, because the comparison that I'm using is number equals 10. So for example, if you had something like 0.5 here as the initial condition, when you get to the 10, it's going to come in here with a 9.5. It's going to say, hey, is 9.5 equal to 10? Well, no. And then it's going to output it, and then it's going to add ones, and then you'll have 10.5. Then you'll be asking, is 10.5 equal to 10? And of course, it'll never equal 10. So this will just loop forever. So the way that you would normally fix that, like someone's saying, is that you would change this to less than or equal to, until number is, greater than or equal to 10. You would change it that way, and then you get the thing that you want. Someone asked why there are 2 equal signs. So we covered this a little bit yesterday. So if you haven't, if you haven't watched yesterday, go back and watch yesterday. But the difference is that equals is for assignment and double equals is for comparison. They mean different things. The next question is, how do you check for multiple variables? And the supposition maybe is that you could use and to check multiple variables. And that's right. So if you want to check multiple variables, you will write something like while number is less than 10 and name is John. You can do that. So just the same way that you would do in an if, it works the exact same way in a while. And you're probably wondering why I wrote that here instead of writing it here. And the reason is because it's just really confusing to figure out what the hell this means. Like, think about if you were to try to say this out loud. I want you to loop until the number is less than 10 and the name is John. Like, I mean, I just said that out of my own mouth, and I don't even know what it means. So typically when you're combining multiple conditions together, you will purposely flip them around so that you can use a while instead of an until. I hope that makes sense. Yeah, the difference between until and while, I'm going to go over it just one more time. So you can think of while as saying, while this thing is true, execute the loop. So just read it out loud. While the condition is true, execute the loop. The until is until the condition is true, execute the loop. So you can think, the most easy way to think of it is that while condition and while not condition and until condition, these are the same. They work the same way. They're exactly the same. It's just a way to write it and not have to write while. And I would not teach you it, except for the fact that you're going to see it just everywhere. So I have to teach you it. Another thing I want to mention here is that all of these, everything, can be written on one line. This is another thing you're going to see pretty often. So you can actually take the conditional and put it after the statement that you're writing. You're going to see this everywhere. So if you have a simple conditional and your conditional is something like if number equals 10, puts name, this 3 lines is the same as this 1 line. In a lot of other programming languages, you would write it the other way around. You'd write something like this. Not in Ruby, that won't work. The way you have to do it is this. It's called a postfix if. This works with everything. It works with while, works with until. No, the indents don't matter. If you really want to, you can write your code like this. Just everyone's going to think that you don't know what you're doing. So I'm going to try to write the code the way that that you would, which is normally that if you're inside of an if, you will indent the things inside of it. And that is so that when you look at it, you can visually see how even the editor is trying to put a line between them. It's trying to say that everything inside of there is inside of the if, which it is. Postfix. So when you take something like, let's say you did like number plus plus, this is called postfix because it's after the number, and prefix would be before the number. But that's not, you don't need those terms. It's just the name of it in case anyone wants to look it up. Okay, next question is, there's one more, which is there's a do while loop that runs the loop one time no matter what. There is a do while loop. I'm not going to cover it. Rubyists tend to not use it. And if you're at an advanced enough stage in Ruby that you need one, then you probably can either look it up or you've already found it by then. But it just confuses beginners. I'm not going to talk about it. Yeah, that's another good question. Someone asked, is there a for loop? So if you're in a lot of other languages, you expect there to be a for loop, something like this, which is complicated to read. This does not exist like this in Ruby. Ruby technically does have a for loop, but it is not something that you should ever use. So the way it would work is like for n in array. If I see you write code like this, I'm going to yell at you. There's better ways to do practically every place that you would ever want to use a for loop. There's a better, cleaner way to do it with either a while loop or an each block, which we're going to talk about in a second. Yeah, ranges for for loop. Again, no one should use a for loop. Don't use a for loop. So throw away in your head that for loops are a possibility. For loops, the way that you know them, do not exist in Ruby. So there is no like typical for loop has a initializer, a conditional, a comparison. Sorry, initializer, conditional, and modifier. That concept does not exist here. There is nothing like that. The next thing I want to talk about, it's important for loops, so we have to talk about it, is breaking flow control. So let's say your number is 5, and you want to do something like loop do number plus equals 1. You can do break if number is greater than 10. And when you write break here, this is a way to get yourself out of a loop. So if you're stuck inside of a loop and you need to write a line of code that says to get out of this loop, this is how you do it. So if I run this, what have I done? Number, what did, right, I didn't output anything. Thank you. Yeah, so that's how that works. If you want to write a loop where you manually break, this is how you do it. I'm only teaching you this, not so that you need it, because you're not going to need it, just so that if you see it. So if you're inside of a loop and you see a break, this is what it does. Yeah, I mean, it depends what you're trying to do. The puts can be after the break if you want. If you're trying to replicate a different type of loop, you might want to put it in a different order, but I'm just trying to demonstrate what the break does. Yeah, loop do, if you come from a different programming language, is something like this, while true, or in C, while one. Okay. Is there a computer language using other than English? There are computer languages using other than English, but for the most part, all major computer languages do not, their commands themselves, like loop, are in English. It's kind of like a lingua franca of programming. When to use loop do over while and other loops? Yeah. So someone mentioned in the chat, they were like, should the puts be after the break? I think that's a valid thing. But the thing is that if you're trying to replicate what a while loop does, you should just use a while loop. You want to use whatever thing is going to make the code shortest. So you are not very often are you going to see loop do anywhere in anyone's code, because it is just so easy to mistakenly create an infinite loop with it. The more common thing you'll see is while loops and until loops. Yeah, so someone mentioned being at SAP and writing a lot of code with German in it. Definitely there are a lot of people that write code where like strings or variable names are non-English. Like, for example, I can write anything I want here, right? So I could write, this is a UTF-8 compatible language. So technically my variable name can be anything. The problem is with learning in a different language is that when someone tells you like, you have a variable name and it's named something that's from your language. And then when someone says like, oh, and then when you want to loop, you have to write loop do. That can be confusing for people in different languages. Because you don't get the advantage of being able to read the word and kind of know what it means. Oh, great. Yeah, so it sounds like there's a programming language called ABAP where it's written in German. I appreciate the context. Cool. So all of the iterators, all the loop forms that I just showed you pale in comparison to the most important one, which I am going to show you, and then we are going to go on a 10-minute break. So this is part of the reason that you would never use that for form that I showed before, is that instead you would write it like this. So you have ARR, which I'll call array instead. You have array, which puts in an array of these three numbers, and then you call array dot each do. And inside of the block is the thing that you want to do for each element of the array. So think about that. Array equals 1, 2, 3. And then array each means go through each element in the array and do this thing for each one. So you can see the output 1, 2, 3 is 1, 2, 3. This is how you iterate over the elements of an array. And you may have guessed, but the thing between the two pipes here is the actual thing that you are, the thing in each iteration that you're operating on. So first it's going to run this block with number being equal to 1. Then it's going to run this block with number being equal to 2. Then the same with number equal to 3. And for those curious about whether it works for hashes as well, let's just do it real quick. I'm not 45. So hash.each do key value. So the only difference is that you have to, that when you get this part where you're taking something in, you take two things in. They're separated by a comma. These are the names that you want to refer to them by inside of this block. So you want to go through each thing in the hash. And because all hashes are composed of a key and a value, you need to get both into this block, and then you'll get them here. So if I run this, we'll see it outputs name, John, age 34. Yeah, it's pretty awesome. It's really cool. It's like, it's just a really, if you've been in another programming language, it's a very concise and beautiful way to represent this loop, where in other languages, it does not read nearly as nice as this does. We'll talk about a whole bunch of different ways to do that too. So we're on break now. If anyone needs to go to the bathroom or anything, yeah, you can do that. I'm going to keep answering questions because y'all are asking some really good questions in here. Okay, the first one I'm going to take is what about strings? And again, if you don't mind, if you can use the Q&A function, it's just going to make it a lot easier for me to manage what's going on here. So let's put hello in a string, and then let's try it. So I'm going to rename this to string, and let's do string.each do, and at this point it would be a single character, right? So we'll call it character, and then we'll puts character. So what happens? Oh no, an error. Let's read the error. It says undefined method each for string. Well, luckily I have the string documentation right here. I can make it bigger so you can all see it. Let's take a look at the left-hand side here and read. So there is no method each in here. But there is another method called each char. So let's read what that sounds. It sounds like something that might be useful because it sounds like each character. So let's read this. Passes each character in string to the given block. So look at the example. Hello.each char C print C. So let's try that in our code. Each, we'll just change to each char. And let's run it. Boop, it works. So yes, it works the same way. While a string doesn't have an each method, it has an each char method that does the same thing. Okay. Okay. The next question is, can you go over when to use parentheses versus pipes versus square brackets versus squigglies? Yes, I'll be happy to do that. So parentheses are used when you are calling a method and you want to be able to pass it an argument. So parentheses are used. You have a name of a method that you want to call, which we're going to talk a lot about methods today. Name of a method you want to call, and you want to pass it an argument. That's where these parentheses go. And for anyone listening, I know there are other uses of parentheses, which we are going to talk about at some point, but just confusing right now. So this parentheses right here, that's what they're for. The next one is, when are you going to use square braces? You're going to use square braces when you're talking about an array. So you're talking about the access of a certain thing inside of an array, or you're talking about defining a new array. That's when you're going to use the square braces. You will use the hash, the curly braces, when you're defining a hash, but not when you're accessing members of the hash. When you're accessing members of the hash, you're still going to use the square braces. So think of square braces are for access. Curly braces are for definition of a hash. Square braces are for definition of an array. The parentheses are for calling a method. And of course, they're optional in this case. And the last one is the pipe, which is used when using an iterator like this They're used around the arguments for the iterator. Okay, next question is, what if there's a string n number in an array? Yep, let's try it. Array equals 1, 2, John. So it's no problem. Array do each, do item. And let's put item, run that code. You see 1, 2, John. Now, why does that work? It works because the first time that the thing is called, it's essentially running puts 1. Second time it's called, puts 2. Third time it's called, puts John. Because all of those are valid things to happen, it works. So each an array, you can mix different types of things together in the array in Ruby, and it is all good. In the hash.each do key value, can the words key and value be anything that I want them to be? Yes, they can. So in yesterday's example, when we were talking about name to age hash map, you would call them something like name and age. So just to be clear, inside the pipe, the first thing you put inside the pipe is, for the purpose of this block, what do you want to call the keys? And the second thing is, for the purpose of this block, what do you want to call the values? In the case of an array, same thing. Array.each do number. Can also just be array.each do item, array.each do entry. Can be anything you want. All it's saying is, for the purposes of this iteration here, what do you want to call the individual items of the array inside the block? That's a great question. What if you want to loop through the hash, but you need access to only key? Do you have to specify both inside of the square braces? Well, there are a couple ways to do this, and I'm going to tell you the right way to do it, which is you should always include both. If you're not using one, you should put an underscore before it. And that's going to indicate to other people reading the code that this thing is not used. But even better than that in this case is to modify your code. Hash actually has a method called keys on it. So what keys does on hash is it returns an array of all of the keys. So when you do hash.keys.each, you're now putting yourself into a world where you're iterating over an array instead of a hash. What's the difference between using a symbol and string in the context of a hash? I covered that at the beginning of the class today. If you watch a recording, you should be able to find out. Yeah, so someone pointed out that they tried to do this and that name actually outputs the both of the values. And that's why I'm telling you that if you're iterating over a hash, just be really clear about what you're doing, because you'll be confused to find out that if you only include one of these, that this actually becomes an array of the key and the value put together. Okay, each isn't coming up in purple for me. I don't know what comes up in purple. Let's see. If it's not coming up in purple, then you are not set into Ruby syntax mode. You want to make sure it says Ruby down here. If it says something else, you're going to click that and change it to Ruby. You might also need to download the Ruby extension. I said no colon because of it being a symbol, right? Correct. Is there a difference between a method and a function in Ruby? We're going to talk about that when we get into functions, and then we're going to talk about it even more when we get into methods. Actually, probably that's the only time we'll talk about it. Can you give a synonym definition of the word hash? Yeah, I mean, if you want to call it a dictionary, you can call it that. But if you talk to any Ruby developer and you call it a dictionary, they're going to be confused because it's called a hash, and that's what you have to call it in Ruby. So even though it's analogous to things like hash or map or hash table or any dictionary, you call them hashes in Ruby. Just for clarification on the key value, can we name it anything? Yep, you can. How do you take user input? I leave that as an exercise to you. I know a lot of programming courses start with user input, but that's the kind of thing, again, like you're going to do it when you're learning and you'll never use it again. You're never gonna, unless you're writing console applications, ever need that. So if you want it, just look it up. It's called gets, Gets. So it's like puts, but the other way around. Anonymous attendee, if you're not part of the class for the links to the videos, just email me and I'll fix it. I use a method called method, and I can see, yeah, we'll talk about that at some point probably, but for now, I'm not going to talk about it. So, cool. Okay, the break is over. Oh. Is everyone having a good time? I hope that my like drawn out explanations here are helping, and yeah, I will keep going, Greg. Thank you. I work in dark mode. Yeah, I will talk about that. I'll talk about that right now, actually, because I think it could be confusing. Someone asked, hey, I got really confused when you looked at this example here. It looks like it different than what you wrote. And you're right. And I'll show it. I was kind of trying not to show it, but we're going to have to, at some point, we will have to talk about this. So, okay, this is going to be a little complicated. Let's say you're writing hello.each char do, hello.each char do character. This is something we did just a second ago. That can actually be written like this. Or if you want even clearer, you can do, these are the same thing. So the first one is the like kind of full form block. It uses do and end. The second one is a single line form of the same thing. So you can imagine, take the do, replace it with a curly brace, take the end, replace it with a curly brace. Now these are the same. Okay, so if I run these, they're both going to do the same thing. And because I've done that, I can actually just go put it on the same line. And now these are literally exactly the same. So it's just, what I'm trying to say here is that there are two ways to write a block. The first way to write a block is do, end. The second way to write a block is with a curly brace and a curly brace. The rule in Ruby is if you're writing a block that is on multiple lines, you're going to use do, end. And if you're writing one that's on one line, please use the curly braces. Alexis, you're doing great. It's going to be okay. If you have any particular questions, please ask them so that I can make sure to talk about it. So it's confusing that there's two versions of this block, and actually you can, if you really wanted to, you can write it out like, I think you can write it like this. That's all it is. It's the same thing as this. It's just they take the do and the end, and to make them look a little bit nicer, they replace it. But it's the exact same thing. This code here and this code here work exactly the same. Felipe, I think I answered your question. Yeah, Alexis, if you're having trouble with the each not showing up as purple, there's a couple of things to check. The first is that your file is named with a .rb extension. That's the extension you'll need for any kind of a Ruby file. And the second thing is that you want to make sure that Ruby syntax mode is turned on. So if you follow my cursor, I realize it's kind of small, but go down here to this area, you got the bell, then you got this little person with the speech bubble, then it says layout, and then the name of your keyboard layout. And then right to the left of that, there's going to be some other word like shell or plain text or something like that. If you click that, you're going to get this box that pops up. You can type in it, type Ruby. And when you hit enter, it should fix the highlighting. It's called syntax highlighting. It's just what makes it look nice in your editor. And that will also make it so that the run part works as well. Rajesh, I'm gonna save that to the end of the class. If you want to talk about it, just please, if you can copy it and just answer it again at the end, that'd be great. Yeah, I will, Audrey, or sorry, Andrew, I'm going to explain that right now. So Andrew is asking if you do something like this, Andrew, why doesn't this work? The reason that it doesn't work, yeah, the break is over, although we're kind of just like going through questions still. So the reason it doesn't work is that this doesn't mean anything. So you're going to get an error. Actually, let's look at the error. Undefined local variable or method name. So the reason that it doesn't work is because when you write the code like this, it's not the string name. It's actually looking for a variable called name. So if you were to make one, if you were to do something like name equals foo, you run the code again, and it's going to work. It's going to be fine. I hope that makes sense. So the reason is that without the quotes around this, you're not talking about the string name. You are talking about the key being a variable called name. Okay. I followed your instructions regarding the Ruby syntax. Cade, I'm not quite sure, but let's make sure, let's talk about it after class, or you can ask again after class. I want to make sure that we keep going. Okay, so we talked about the Ruby iterator methods, and by virtue of doing that, we talked about Ruby blocks. And now I'm going to talk about some things that you can do with those blocks, because there are some pretty great things that you can do. So in order to do that, I'm going to go to the documentation here for array. And I'm going to highlight a couple methods that we can use in here that are pretty interesting. So the first one that I want to show is called map. Okay, so let's read the documentation for map. It calls the block with each element and returns a new array whose elements are the return values of the block. Phew, little confusing to read because it's written for like a technical audience, but let's just look at the example. So the first thing that they're doing is they're saying, okay, get an array of 3 elements, 3 things. And then a block is when you have do end or you have the curly braces around something. It's just called the block. Okay, so anytime you write do end or you have curly braces surrounding something, that's a block. So it's going to say a.map, so array.map. And then just like we saw before with the each, every time that map gets called, element gets passed into it. And then whatever the last thing that happens in this block is, it will make a new array where those things are in the new array. So let's make our own example, because that example is horrible. So we had an array that was John, Kate, Ernest. Shout out Ernest. And then we did array dot map. And we're going to put this into a variable called new array, or sorry, new array. Do element, or sorry, we'll call it string, string.reverse. And then I'm going to output new array. Okay, so look what it does. It's really cool. It outputs all of the names reversed. And what I would have to do if I wanted to do that differently is I would have to, let's actually think about like what it would take to write something like this. What would it take to write map without map? So what you'd have to do is you'd have to say new array equals an empty array. Then you'd have to do array.each do string. Then you'd have to do new array and insert string.reverse. So this and this are the same. Map is a method that gets the return value of the block, meaning the last thing that happens in the block, and then creates a new array where each element in the new array is what would happen if you ran that block on each of the elements in the original array. So I hope that this top example shows what's happening. It's like you made a new array and you filled that array with all the things. So you can see there, same thing. Okay. If you want, I can even run, I can put them so you can see that they're the same too. Boop, 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 all the same. So new array is empty array, and then go through each and put a reverse version of the new array in, or instead you can make a new array and just call array.map. Someone asks if you want to reverse the array in the sense that it displays them the other way around, then check this out. Array.verse.map. So you can actually chain the method calls together. So first you have an array of these three things, and then you want to call reverse, which is going to return a new array where the elements are backwards. Then you want to call map. So you now have a backwards version of the array where for each element, you are also flipping around the string itself. If I run that, you're going to see, what have I done? Broke it. Undefined variable or method reverse. Array dot reverse. Where did I put? I put reverse somewhere. I think it's just not saved. Let's run this again. Yep, it was just not saved. And I can see it's run. If the code is working, it's doing the thing that we talked about. So I hope that helps you, Anna. Okay, I'm going to do a couple more things that you can do. And I also encourage you to go look at Hash's documentation, because Hash also has a bunch of methods that take a block. So the next one I would like to show you is one called select. I'm choosing to show you these ones because they're the ones that you're going to encounter most. So select. I'll talk about that quickly. So the difference is that each just goes over all the things in the array and does the block for them. So for example, if I took this and I replaced it with each and I run it, it's not going to do anything because there's no puts inside of here. What map does, on the other hand, is it runs this block for every element in the array and returns a new array where the values are these values turned into the new values. So I want you to imagine like you have an array here. It has something like John and maybe Kate. And then what I want you to imagine the map as doing is being like, there's this thing that happens in the middle, like a grinder or something, you know, something that turns one thing into another thing. And I want you to imagine what it's doing is first it's going through and it's saying, okay, take John and run this thing on John. And then it's like, the new thing that is John is Naj. And then the new thing that's Kate is Itak. And this is the new array. So you have this array that goes in and this array that comes out. Hope that makes sense. Each just goes through each of the things. Map goes through each of them, but collects the results of each of the blocks and creates a new array over here. Okay, so the next one I'm going to show you is select. So here I'm going to say new array again. I'm going to do array.select do string. So same exact thing I wrote before when I wrote each or I wrote map, except here instead I'm writing select. Now you probably can intuit from the name select that what we're doing is we're going to select some of the elements out of here. So what I'll do is I'll say string.length is 4. And then let's output the new array. Okay, so here you can see John and Kate, but no Ernest. Sorry, Ernest, you're not in new array. So what select is doing is it's saying, actually, we can even read the documentation. Call the block with each element and return a new array containing only those elements of self for which the block returns a true value. So it's going to pick out only the things where this is true. So does John have 4 letters? Yes. Does Kate have 4 letters? Yes. Does Ernest have 4 letters? No. So the new array will contain only John and Kate and no Ernest. So you can use select to, I want you to think of it as filter the array. You can take one array, you can turn it into another array. In fact, if you look here, it says filter is an alias for select. So you, if you prefer it, can literally just write filter instead. But the normal one you'll see other Ruby developers writing is select. So array.select do string. Yeah, you specify based on your code block. So the logic inside of the code block is the thing determining what gets selected. Okay, so now because this is Ruby and because there are things like while, until, of course, array has a reject method. So what reject does is it does the same thing as select, but the other way around. So reject will only keep things for which the block returns false. So let's run it, and you'll see that the output is only Ernest. For the most part, it's the same as this. Select where length is not equal to 4. You can refer to the current element in the block by whatever name you've put inside of these pipes. That's the name by which you're going to refer to the elements inside the block. I encourage you to go look a couple of these up. Yeah, not as hard as Java or JavaScript. That's right. It is, the syntax is much more forgiving because there's a lot less like, you know, of these and these. Like syntax is a lot less forgiving. And on top of that, it reads nicely. So when you're actually looking at how it reads like English. I'm going to show you a couple more really quick. I'm going to show you this one, all. And these I'm going to go through fairly quickly because I think they're pretty repetitive. So imagine I created a variable called Boolean. I called this method all ? Can anyone guess what all ? does? So what all ? does is it runs the block for each thing in the array. And what it's saying is this block true for every element of the array. So you can read this as saying, are all of the things in the array of length 4? Are all of the things in the array 4 characters long? Okay, I'm going to run it. I've messed something up. I think it's because I used the word Boolean probably. False. It's false because all of these things are not 4 letters long. Of course, it has a friend called any that does what you'd expect, which is, are any of the things in here 4 characters long? There's even none. Are none of the things in here 4 characters long? Okay. I have a couple of questions. I'm going to go through the questions. And then I want to talk about 2 more quick things. And we will then go on to functions. And that's going to be really fun. So the first question here is there an empty value in the new array? And I assume what they're talking about when they talk about that is this select new value. And the answer is no. Sorry, new array. So the answer is no. New array is of length 2. And array is of length 3. Actually verify that too. We'll put new array length 2. This is how I want you to think, like I was saying yesterday. Have a question, write the code, see what it does. Anna, yep, you got it right. That's correct. And yeah, you can compare the arrays, the original and the map. You can compare them to each other. I would say if you're interested in doing that, just look through the documentation to find the way to do that. Cool. So the couple of things that I want to talk about real quickly are this. So just like there can be methods that have a question mark in them, there can also be methods that have a bang sign in them. And in Ruby, what these bang sign methods typically mean is that they modify something in place. So just to demonstrate what that means, I'm going to remove the new array equals part. And I'm going to change this to be puts array. I'm going to run it again. You can see now John and Kate. So while select without the bang returns a new array, select with the bang says, please just modify the array that's already here. So when we see this in the future and we see select bang, we have to understand that it's actually modifying the array, as opposed to select, like we were saying, if we run that, does not modify the array. The original array stays how it was, and it returns a new array that does the thing we want. Don't worry if this select bang thing doesn't make any sense. When we get into real objects tomorrow, it's going to make more sense. And the last thing I want to show here is this. So if I write some code like this, it says 2 times do puts John. So that does exactly what you would expect it to do. It says 2 times do this block and then puts John inside the block. So what the hell? Like, how does that work? And the reason that it works is because 2 is an integer. And if we look at an integer, there's a method on integer called times. And times, just like the each method on array, there's nothing special about arrays or integers. They're all just objects. So because they're all objects, times is just a method that takes a block and runs that block the number of times. So if you have to do something 10 times, or if you have a variable called 10 and you have to do something number times, you can do that. And this goes even deeper. For anyone that's looking for something to experiment on their own time, you can actually do times.map too. So let's not get too far into the weeds stuff. Just know that times exist, and I guess even more importantly, know that there's nothing special like a lot of languages have where numbers or strings are special types of objects. There is nothing special about numbers in Ruby. They're just numbers. And they're just objects like everything else in Ruby. Everything is an object. They all work exactly the same way. So just like everything else, numbers can have methods. So for example, round. If I want to round a number, I can just call dot round on the number because a number is just an object. Okay. If you don't know what objects are, we're going to talk about objects tomorrow. But do know in the meantime that you can do 10.times do and then something inside. Okay, I'm gonna go through a couple of questions. Can you do new array equals array.each do string and it would be the same thing as map? No, you cannot. And I'm gonna do it for you. We have live class every day, Monday through Thursday, for the next 4 weeks. The last day is March 25th. Array.each do number. Okay. And let's set new value equal to that. And let's output, actually in here, let's do number plus 10. Okay, so you see what happens when I do each is it outputs 1, 2, 3. Even though inside the block, I added 10 to all the numbers. And if I do map, let's run it again, 11, 12, 13. Now it behaves the way you would think. And it's because of how each works. Let me go look at each. Go to the documentation. Let's go to each. What does it say here? It says iterates over array elements. And down at the bottom here, where is it? Oh, even right here, returns self, which means that array.each does not return a new array where all of the elements have been transformed by the inside of the block. It always just returns whatever array it's called on. So it's not the same as map because map returns a new array where the things have been modified. And each just returns array. So in this case, new value will always be the exact same object as array. I hope that makes sense. Next, so someone says, so I could mean false and also do a modification to the array. Is it like bang before a command is false and after a modification? Oh, sorry, I think I read that incorrectly. So bang could mean false and also a modification to the array. Bang will not mean, oh yes, okay. So I think I get what you're saying. If you do something like this, let's say you had a variable that was called var and it said true, and you did puts not var. In this case, bang means not. And all it does is it takes whatever thing you're about to do and it flips it the other way. So if it's true, it turns it false. If it's false, it turns it true. Bang on a method like select bang is literally just part of the name of the method, which I know is confusing coming from other languages. But you have to trust me that it makes a big difference when you're reading the language. Select bang is just another method on array. There's nothing special about it. The bang part here is just part of the name of the method, just like there are some methods like any where part of the name includes a question mark. Erica has programmed in another programming language and has zoomed in on an important fact, which is that unlike other languages, you didn't see me write return at all. So there was no, if I have this, There normally in other languages like JavaScript, you would expect here have to write return. Actually, in Ruby, you can't do this because return inside of a block. We will learn what this means eventually, but inside of a block does not do what you would expect it to do. The way that blocks work is that the value that they are operating on after each iteration is whatever the last statement inside this block is. So if someone's asking if there is no nil return, meaning they would look at this and they would say something like, okay, imagine I wanted new value. Right now it's going to contain 1, 2, 3 because the last thing in it is number. Imagine I wanted it to not do that. You would have to explicitly write nil as the last thing inside your block to get that to happen, because by default, the last thing in the block is the thing that will be returned. So unlike other languages where the lack of a return implies that the value that you would want would be nil, not in Ruby. It's the last thing that happens inside the block. Sounds crazy. It's not crazy. It's awesome. And actually, when we get to methods, you're going to think it's even more crazy, but it's not. It's awesome. Again. What's the point of each? So the point of each is to iterate over the things in an array. So if you have an array where it's 1, 2, 3, and you want to do array.each do puts number, that is the easiest way to put out each number in the array. Otherwise, you would have to do something super complicated, like while index is less than array.length, index plus, like you'd have to write a bunch of code to do the same thing. So they provide these handy methods like each, which let you iterate over an array. Can you do array equals array.each do string? You can do that, but there's no point to doing that because, like I said, array.each is always going to return array. So you will have set the variable to the thing that it already is every single time. Could you do another example with a method that has a bang operator? Sure. So you have array equals 1, 2, 3, array.select bang number, where number is 2, and then puts ARR is only going to contain 2. Run it, 2. Yep, okay. And it's extremely crazy. My head is banging. That is what learning feels like. So yeah, I mean, my head did the same thing when I first learned it. It's awesome though. Are methods the same as functions? Again, I'm gonna save that question for tomorrow. But today, super important that we get to functions because we need them to do the exercise, and we also need them to be able to keep the course on track. So what is a function? Function are things like select or any or other things like that. It's written with def, and then you want to write the name of the function, or let's say output. We'll call the function output, and then we'll make it take in a string. This is a function. Okay. So just to go over the parts of this again, it says def, which says define, and then a space, and then the name of the function, and then the variables that it takes in. And you might be wondering, if you're new to programming, why functions? Why do we need functions? And the reason is because we want to be able to take a piece of behavior and wrap it up in something that we can use over and over again. So imagine we wanted to print John.reverse, and then we wanted to print Kate.reverse, and we wanted to do this. We could do that, or we can make a method, and we could call it print reverse that does print string.reverse, And then instead of writing all of the code over and over again for all the things that we want to do, we could write print reverse Kate and print reverse Sean. So this is why functions. It's so that you can take a piece of behavior and wrap it up in a box that you can call over and over again. It's like, you can think of it like you have someone that's helping you with something. You tell them how to do something. Maybe you tell them how to fold a shirt. And then you can hand them a shirt and you say, fold shirt. You hand them another shirt, you fold shirt. That's a function. It's you've taught someone how to do something. You've wrapped that up in a name, and then you're able to call that name whenever you want. You can have that behavior written once and use it in different places. That's what a function is. I'm going to go through some things about no. So someone mentions they want to have print reverse and have it taken two names at the same time. So something like this. Will that work? It won't work. And the reason it won't work is because print reverse only takes in one name, takes in one variable called string. So if you wanted to do multiple, the way that you're saying, the way you would do it is you could do johnkate.each, do name, and you could do print reverse name. Cool. So I'm going to go through some things that you can do with a function. Some of these might be obvious, some of them might not be, but these are less so you can define functions that use these things, more so that when you see them, you know what they are. The first one is that functions don't have to have arguments. So if I wanted to make a function called print John that just did puts John, that's a valid function. Notice I did not do this like you would do in another method. Same thing as calling functions. When you have one and it's empty, you just leave it off. So to call that, you would do like this. Again, you would not do this. It will work, but it's not normal to do. So you take those away and you run it. It's going to do the right thing. Okay. So that's an empty method. And we already saw a method that takes in something. So if you do that and we do print name, John, you can run that. And you can actually see that if I don't specify this name and I just call it with nothing, it's going to error. And it's going to error for a good reason. It's going to say the wrong number of arguments. It was given 0 arguments, but expected 1 argument. You gave it nothing. It wanted one thing. The next thing is I'm gonna hold off on a couple of these things, but one thing I do need to talk about is that methods have an input, or functions have an input, and they have an output. Okay, so think like you have with this, John goes in, and then Naj comes out. So methods have an input and an output. So let's call this method and let's get its output. So we'll put the output into a variable called output so that we can see what happens. So I'm going to put output. I'm going to run it. Okay, so what happened here? We saw John print because that's what happens inside of print name, but then nothing prints after it. So why does that happen? Now, the obvious thing to think would be that it's because we didn't return anything from the method. So let's challenge that. Oh, cool. So now we added return and we returned 42. So we've had a method that takes in a name, outputs the name, and then returns 42. And now I'm going to blow your mind because in Ruby, you don't write return. So I'm going to erase this part, run the code again, and you'll see it still works because Ruby has what's called implicit return. every Ruby developer uses this. And the way that it works is that a method by default will return the last thing that happens in the method. This is implicit return. So writing 42 here is the same thing as writing return 42. Implicit return. So for anyone wondering why, when we ran it before, we got nil, it's not because we didn't return. It's because the return value of puts is nil. Puts returns nil. So here's a method. We can define a method if we want called add. Maybe the method takes in number 1 and takes in number 2. And then we could write return number 1 plus number 2. But in Ruby, like I just said, we're just going to write it like this. Add takes in 2 numbers and returns the sum of the 2 numbers. So let's try it out. So puts add 2, 5, 4. Run 6. This one, implicit return. Okay. I'm going to show you, I'm going to answer a couple questions, and then I'm going to show you the homework that we're going to have today. I'm guessing there are a bunch of questions. So if you're confused about this, let's spend the time right now. Let's figure this out, because this is necessary. To answer the question in the chat is not because name is undefined. It's because you can think of, so the way implicit, every time you see implicit return, every time that you see a method that is going to have some kind of implicit return, I want you to think of it like this is what's happening. Because you're outputting the last thing that happened. Sorry. I want you to think of the thing that I had previously, which was, again, this implicit return. I want you to think of it like this, because this is exactly what's happening. It's taking whatever the last thing that happens, which is puts name, and it's essentially returning the return value of puts name. Because remember, at the end of the day, puts is a method, just like everything else. If you want to put the parentheses to make it really clear that it's a method, you can. So puts name is a method, and the return value of that method is nil. So output equals puts name returns nil, and then we are essentially calling return nil. So in this case, it's doing the same thing, except with the implicit return. The return value of add, in this case, is the same as the return value of puts, which is nil. And I can show you puts, documentation, Ruby, kernel puts, returns nil. It's just part of how puts works. Okay, puts returns nil. You'll never have to know puts returns nil. It's just a way to explain what this code is doing and why it might be confusing to you. Okay, next question is, wouldn't it be more work to write the function and then request the behavior than just actually write the behavior? Yes, in the case that I showed, that's true. But consider something like this: def add, like add and print number. I'm going to take the number. I'm going to add 1 to it. So I'm going to call it print number. I'm going to take print number times do each. Times do, and then in here I'm going to puts hello, the number of times, and then in here I'm going to do this. I think you're getting what I'm saying is that while it's a contrived example that it only had 1 line before, a lot of times these methods are doing a lot more work. They're maybe calling out to a server, or they're rendering some HTML, or they're downloading some images, or they're uploading something to a file server somewhere. So That's why you need functions. The other reason you need functions is because it's how you organize your code. So what's really convenient here is you're able to take something like this. You say add and print method. Okay, let's write what it does. This method increments the number and outputs, outputs hello, that number of times. Now, think about that. I can collapse all of this inside. I don't have to think about what's in here anymore. All I have to think about is the fact that now I have something that I can do this behavior with. I guess like the analogy to the thing I was saying before is once I've taught someone to fold shirt, I don't have to think every time about how a shirt gets folded. I don't have to think anymore about it. Now I have a behavior, I have a word that I can use to refer to the fact that I want that thing done. In this case, it's add and print. Okay, a question that I see in the chat, and if you have questions, try to put them in the Q&A when you can. But I'm trying to see both. If you do, someone's asking if you need to do number equals to make it work. You do in this case because number plus 1 does not modify number. Think of it as like a statement, right? This is about number plus 1. So just to really drive that home, if I had a number, it's 5, I do number plus 1, and I put number, you're going to see the answer is 5. Number plus 1 doesn't do anything. It only does something with the equals, 6. So read this as number equals 5. Okay, now number plus 1. And then read the other version as number equals 5. Now number equals number plus 1. So without an assignment, it's not going to modify anything. Okay, next question. How does the interpreter know if it's a method or a variable when you're not adding the parenthesis and a colon? The answer is that it does not matter. So the question essentially is this. Def name 42 and age equals 42. Puts name, puts age. These look the same. They both work. They both work the same way. This is one of the most beautiful parts of Ruby, in my opinion, is the fact that methods with no params don't need any kind of parens or parenthesis. So because of that, you don't have to care when you're writing your code whether or not the thing is a local variable or is a method or anything like that. This, you will see over the next couple of days, is an amazing and beautiful property of this language, that it does not matter what the difference is. If you want to wrap your head around how this works, basically there are just like names, and the compiler knows how to find those names, and then it can resolve them. You can search more details on Google, though. A lot of things to unlearn to use Ruby for someone coming from a different language. That I think is partially true. I mean, like if you're thinking about things like syntax, then that's certainly true. But if you're thinking about things like the actual fundamentals of the language, Ruby is inspired by a lot of common languages that that you use. And actually has like once you get past things like the block form being the way it is, has a lot in common with other languages. Yep. Next question is, how do you do the implicit return? You don't have to do anything. When you do an implicit return, it just happens. It's whatever the last thing in the method is. So if I had something like this, and I do a bunch of stuff inside of here, the return value is going to be the last thing, 42. The next question is, do you need to write add name once you defined it, or can you also do add name with no parens? You can do either. So the same way that puts works, you can do that. Although I will tell you that typically the style preference is to include the parens if there are arguments. So if you do, let's say a method called say hello name, and in here you did puts hello name, you can either write that as say hello John or say hello John, Those are the same. Doesn't matter. But again, the preference is for the second one, just because it is a little bit clearer. Is there an optimal length of a function that should not exceed? I mean, you try to keep it reasonable. I would say like 10 lines is a point where you shouldn't go beyond. And the way that you stop yourself from going past 10 lines is you can create functions that the function calls. So we'll talk about that real quick. If we had a method called reverse name here that did something like name.reverse, we can actually call that anywhere inside of another method. So here's a function that calls a function. Just wanted to confirm on line 1, you define the input. Line 2 onward, you define what do you want to do to the input. And after the def loop, you can output using the defined function. I think this is probably about some old code that I wrote. But if it is about one of these, I think I can still describe it, which is, yes, line 1, you are defing. Line 2, you're doing something. And then potentially line 3, you're specifying the return value. Whatever the last line is the return. If I didn't answer your question, please ask it again. Why would you need methods without variables? Shouldn't they all do something? No, I think it's possible to have methods without variables. So imagine there is a, imagine you want to make a beep on the computer. You might have a method called beep. That method doesn't have to take any variables in because it already knows how to do the thing that it has to do. So that's the case where you would want to not have variables. And also tomorrow when we do classes and objects, you'll see that there are a lot of other places where you don't need an argument to a method. We're going to look at that again tomorrow, but I will agree with you that for the most part, functions take in arguments. Sorry, we're almost at time, so I will take a break from questions in a minute. I'm going to describe the homework. I'm going to answer, are they called variables or arguments? They're called arguments. So when a variable sits out by itself like this, it's a variable. When it's to a function, it's called an argument. Yes, you can have multiple functions in your code, of course. And I will explain the functions and outputs again. If you want me to, say it in the chat and I'll describe it again. Otherwise, I'm going to start doing the homework too. Okay. So for your homework, there's going to be 4 exercises. The first exercise, I want you to create an array of 5 names, and I'll be emailing this out, so don't worry, don't try to copy it right now if you don't need to. Create an array of 5 names, all lowercase. I want you to go through each of the names, and I want you to output a sentence containing the name and length of the names. This is very similar to what we did yesterday, but with using an each. If the name has an even number of letters, I want you to capitalize the name. Exercise 2, so you're going to need an if somewhere in there in order to do that behavior. Exercise 2, I want you to create a function that takes in a name and a number. And the function should output the name the right number of times. Exercise 3, write and use a function that returns the largest number in a given array. So there is a method on array called max that you can use to do that. And the second part of the question is now try to do the same without using max. So try to write your own implementation of max. And exercise 4, admittedly, this one is pretty hard. So challenge yourself and try to make it happen. I want you to write a function that takes in an array of strings and puts them out inside of a box. So for example, if you had John, Kate, Jimmy, I want it to output like this. So how can you make that box stay consistent with, despite the names having different lengths? So you'll notice that we have John, and then there's a space here. Okay, so for this, you might need tools that we discussed today. For example, print instead of puts. You're going to need if, and you're going to need comparisons. This is a pretty hard example, but I think you can do it. So I'll be sure to send that out so that you can all have it. And I'll stick around and continue to answer questions if people have them. Otherwise, we're at the end of the course here. So, okay, it depends on the complexity. Can you run that reverse code? Yep, so there it is. You run the reverse code. First, it does it once, then it does it with the parens. I hope you all had a really good time today. Anyone that doesn't have more questions can drop off, and I really look forward to seeing you all tomorrow. If you do have questions, just keep dropping them in the chat. I'll stick around for a bit. See you, Justin. The session is recorded to rewatch. I will have it uploaded probably in about an hour, and I'll email it out to all of you. And as normal, if anyone has questions and they want to ask them asynchronously, you can ask them either on the discussions board, or you can go ask them on the Slack is another great place to get more details. Someone says, shouldn't we create a new file in our Codespace instead of editing the main.rb file? Yeah, you can do that. If you want to keep your work over time, you can do that. I'll find it no matter what. I know a lot of people, what they're doing is they're creating a new file and they're calling it somewhat like homework2.rb or homework3.rb. I mean, that's helpful for me. When I see that, it makes it easier because I can go find the file easier, but I'll find it no matter what. Okay, look, I don't have any more questions. Oh, another question. Is it possible for you to publish all the assignments for the week at once? I'm not going to do that. I appreciate why someone would want that, but I'm not going to do that. And the reason is because I want you to pace yourself with the class that we're doing. Yeah, I think if you already know Ruby and you're looking for a recommendation or similar, that there are probably better ways to go about that. But if what you're looking for is to be able to batch up the work, I really don't recommend that. And I'm not going to be sending out the exercises ahead of time. The next, Alexis, the syntax issues with the purple highlighted commands. I think I don't quite understand what you mean. The syntax issue is with the purple highlighted commands. But what you want is to set the syntax. And if it's helpful, you can send me maybe some screenshots of what you're seeing, then I can maybe annotate them to tell you where to click. Next question, I'm new to coding. Can you explain functions and outputs again with the return function without using the return function? Yeah, so you have a method. You want to do something like add num1, num2, and then you want to have it return something, num1 plus num2. So this is a method that I've created where you can call it with two numbers, and it's going to return the last thing in here. So it'll return the value of num1 plus num2. You can read it exactly as if it was that, except you don't have to write return. So now it's just num1 plus num2. And I can even show you using that. Looks like this. If that doesn't help and you ask a more specific question, I'll be happy to do it. But essentially think of a function as wrapping up some behavior. So if I even made a thing that was like add plus 42, that I could make it add something on top of whatever it was passed. That's maybe add plus 42. So now this method does something a little bit more complicated, but really very similar. A method or a function is a way to just wrap up some behavior in essentially a box that you can use over and over again. Mr. John, I would like to email you after class. I don't know how to do it. Yeah, if you can't get to the code thing and you're having problems accessing it, just email me. Make sure you include your GitHub username so that I can make sure that you're in the right place and right organization to get what you need. Okay, Rajesh says, actually, I'm going to first do Julie's question. I just saw in the chat down here. Hi, John. Not sure if this is out of scope when you're showing, but I'm having trouble wrapping my head around strings being mutable in Ruby, but not in JavaScript. For example, reverse bang method on strings. Yeah, it is confusing. So like Julie mentions strings, if you had a string and you do something like string dot reverse bang, and you put string, this reverse bang method modifies the string in place. And it is very confusing. Julie, strings in Ruby are essentially copy on write. So when you go to use a string like this, if you have several things that are referring to the same string, when you call reverse bang, what it does is it makes a new string and then places that into the string, into the thing represented by string here. It's a little confusing to understand because like Ruby doesn't, there are no pointers in Ruby, but the idea is the same. It's modifying it in place. Strings are mutable. There's actually a method even on string called freeze, which will make it so that the string is not mutable. So you'll see an error like this, can't modify frozen string. So if you want to ensure that a string does not get mutated, just call freeze. Okay, Rajesh says words equals, and words.min, words.max, it outputs a plus b. On what basis is giving that output? Okay, let's take a look. Okay, so if you do .min on an array of characters, it's going to compare them what's called lexigraphically, which means it's going to compare them the same way that you would essentially compare them in like a dictionary. So with that in mind, let's think about what it's going to do. First, it's going to say puts, then it's going to do words.min, right? Then it's going to do words.max. So you can think of words.min, evaluate that by itself. What is the min word if these were in a dictionary? The answer is A. Because I'm interpolating A inside of just A. So the answer, like the thing that this is just the character A. And words.max is the max thing because all of these start with A. You're only thinking about really these two. The second one is the one that would come later in the dictionary is BA. So you can think of this as BA. So that's why it's A plus BA. Next question. Now I understand what I said yesterday, that it usually takes weeks for other boot camps to cover this topic. Mind equals blown. Thank you, John. Yeah, I think, Andre, if these topics are covered like they would traditionally be covered in like a boot camp or a coding course in college, they're going to take a long time to go through these topics. And it's because they're going to get distracted with all kinds of edge cases that you'll never actually see in real code. I'm focusing on the things that you're actually going to see. Down in the chat here, someone says, so freeze is like making a variable final or const. Kind of. The answer is kind of, because it's not actually turning it into a const. What it's doing is, okay, this is a little bit of a sneak preview for tomorrow, but let's say if str equals the string hello. This is actually not a string, just like the number that I was saying before, when we did 42.times and we had a block. String is an object. So this is a thing of type string, right? So freeze, all freeze does is set some internal state on the object that makes it so that when you try to modify it, it raises an error. So I could show you how to implement that, but I probably am going to wait till tomorrow on that because it's going to be really, really confusing for anyone that doesn't know what classes are yet. But just to tell you that it's not like final. It's not a language level constraint. It's an object level constraint. I'm getting red and blue commands. You can send me a screenshot or drop a screenshot in Slack and maybe someone else can help out. Someone says code star. I appreciate that. That's very nice of you. I assume that I'm the code star. Just remember the question about every one of participants makes a quiz question. Yeah, that's a fun idea. If you could coordinate that in Slack, I think it's a cool idea. I won't be able to organize it just because it's just too much. Carmen says, in my mind, hashes are like a table with 2 columns that can have infinite rows. Is there a way to add more columns to the hashes, or is there another type of object that's more like a table or data frame? Carmen, I would say that that thinking of hash is a little dangerous because it's not like that. What you should think about it instead as is like an index file. It's sitting on your table, and you're able to go to some certain thing and find the value. So I guess what I'm trying to say is that the key and value in a hash are not, they're not equally as important. They have different properties, meaning like in a hash, it's very quick to look something up by key. It's very slow to look something up by value though. And it's like a dictionary. Okay, so imagine you had a dictionary in front of you and you wanted to be able to find my name in the dictionary. Now it's really easy because the dictionary lets you go to the C's and then you just you just go to CR, then you go to CRE, and you're eventually going to find my name. Now imagine if I said, I put a dictionary in front of, or so I put a phone book in front of you and I said, find me the phone number that is this particular phone number. That's a lot harder because now it has to go through every single number in the book potentially to find the number. And that's why hashes can't really be thought as something that has two columns. I want you to think of it instead as something that has a key and a value. The key is like the thing you need to get the value. I hope that makes sense. And as far as whether there's another data structure, there is, and you've already learned it, it's an array. So if you wanted to do a table, you can have an array where the elements inside of it are just other arrays. So you have like thing 1, thing 2, thing 1a, thing 2a. Okay, that's the answer. And actually there's an even better answer that we're going to learn tomorrow. So it's objects. Thank you, John. I appreciate that. Maybe a nitpicky question, but I noticed you'd refer to Ruby org docs. Yeah, there's not much difference between Ruby 2.7.1 and Ruby 3, at least for the purpose of the course. They're consistent. The docs will be exactly the same. They're built to be backward compatible. Anyone that comes from Python will be surprised by that because in Python, when they went from Python 2 to Python 3, they broke a bunch of stuff. Ruby does not work like that. When they put out Ruby 3, it pretty much just runs all the code the same way. It's backward compatible to Ruby 2 for the most part. Okay, somebody put some code. We're gonna play with this code real quick. Okay, so they said, here's a string, my string 1. By the way, name your variables, please, with underscores, snake case. So you would, instead of that, you would do my string 1. Okay, so they're saying that the first one doesn't throw an error, and the second one throws an error. Okay, so let's get into this. First one does not throw an error. Okay, so 0.0. So you're saying from the 0th position to the 0th position, including the thing itself. So that's going to put A, and then it's A.upcase. This one will also be A.upcase. So for the purposes of this, these are exactly the same. Now this is going to return 1 ... is going to return from the first position on, and the second one is going to return from the second position on. So let's take a look at this and let's put some output. So puts here, inspect, and then puts here, inspect, and let's run these. I want to show you the output. So we have string and we have nil. So 1 ... is returning a string, and 2 ... is returning nil. So that's why you're getting an error, is because this one's value is nil. So now a question, I guess, that you're wondering is, why is accessing 2 away from the thing giving an error and accessing 1 away from the thing giving an error, or not giving an error? I'm guessing it's because of a \0 character that would terminate the string, but I don't know offhand and can't find out right now. It's a great question though. I just joined today, DM'd you on Twitter. I got this email, but I don't think I've been added to the Slack or anything yet. Yeah, so if you email me, I'll send you a link to the Slack. It's just been in all the emails up till now. This is also the reason why I have to have closed the course by now. It's because it's very difficult to do the administrative work of having to keep people caught up on things that we've like kind of just all the getting everyone all the right things is hard. Someone says, thanks, John. Thank you. Someone says, hey, John, are we going to end up making a web project? We will. So we're going to start with Ruby. We're going to go through Rails, HTML, JavaScript, CSS, and we're going to make a web project. I don't know how we're going to do it in Codespaces yet, but we'll figure it out. Rajesh says, thank you for your help. I appreciate it. Sewell says, in other languages, there's a difference between parameter and argument. Do we do the same in Ruby, or can both be called argument? Typically, when something gets called parameter, it's because it is a named variable. Ruby does have them. It's called keyword arguments. They're still not called parameters. So, I mean, you can call them parameters if you want, but for the most part, methods take parameters and functions take arguments. Really, these terms are used interchangeably. And the reason that they're used interchangeably is, for the most part, Ruby developers don't write functions. They write methods, meaning like we're going to learn tomorrow, but every method, or see, even I can't say them right. It's like every one of these that you actually write is going to be on an object. And actually in Ruby, they're pretty much all actually methods, because even here in the nothing space, but we're not on a class, we are defining this method on a class. The class just happens to be called kernel. So even here, we're sitting on a class when we define a method. Everything makes sense when I'm watching you code, but it's, yeah, that happens. I would say just keep going with it. Try to lean on the people in the Slack group and try to figure out how they're approaching things. If you stick with it and you keep doing the exercises, it's going to make sense. I guess another thing is to rewatch the videos, and hopefully then you can retrace the steps that got me to where I got. Okay. I appreciate the I will understand you or die. That's a good attitude. All right, everybody, have a good night.